In this segment, we are going to take a look at the cultural, economic, and political issues that divided the nation as we go from conflict to compromise to crisis. A crisis was on the horizon. The nation struggled to resolve sectional issues, that is, North versus South, East versus West. It produced a series of compromises, and these crises took place over things like the admission of new states into the Union during the decades before the Civil War. The issue was always whether the number of free states and slave states would be balanced, thus affecting the power in Congress. As we consider our economic divisions, northern states had predominantly developed an industrial economy that was based on shipping and manufacturing. They tended to favor high protective tariffs, that is to say, high taxes on imported goods. They believed this would help protect their manufacturing. After all, it would raise the price of imports, thus making their prices seem lower and encouraging Americans to buy American-made products. This is a wonderful resource, a way for the government to get money, and it was a way for them to guarantee that they would continue to make money. Economic divisions in the South were a little bit different as the southern states developed an agricultural economy consisting of a slavery-based system of plantations in the lowlands, that is, along the Atlantic Ocean and in the deep South. And then, of course, there were also small subsistence farmers going on in the west, in the foothills, in the valleys, in the Appalachian Mountains. The South strongly opposed high tariffs. That would make the price of imports more expensive, causing those farmers to have to pay more for manufactured goods. Further, Southerners opposed the idea that if we tax imports, the result is going to be our exports would be taxed in those countries. We tax British goods, they tax our goods. What are our goods? Cash crops coming from the South. We tax French goods, they tax our goods, again, taxing our cash crops. And so tariffs seem to benefit only the North and actually hurt the southern states. So they were strongly opposed of these high tariffs. The nation will take steps toward what seems to be an inevitable war, but compromises will postpone this conflict. We'll start with the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise occurred because the territory of Missouri wanted to become a state, and they were very excited about it. They proposed it, they wrote up their constitution, submitted it to Congress, and Congress said, uh-oh, we have a problem with balance. If we allow Missouri to come in as a slave state, that would upset the balance. Northern states said, you may not come in. Southern states said, come on in. And therefore, we nearly have to break into a war over whether or not we will allow Missouri to come in. A solution is going to happen. Missouri will be allowed to enter as a slave state. But at almost the same time, we will allow Maine to enter as a free state. Thus, the power stays balanced. Now, how are we going to prevent this problem from happening again? Somebody in Congress says, let's draw a line across the map. And that's where the line is going to go. Watch it again. There it is. North of that line will be considered free territory. No slavery allowed. South of that line, slavery will be permitted. So any states that come in south will be slave states. Any states that come in the northern area will be free states. This seemed reasonable. It seemed rational, and it seemed to work for a while until Andrew Jackson versus his then Vice President, John C. Calhoun, over what was termed the nullification crisis. These were two men who were relatively good friends. They saw things pretty much the same way. However, John C. Calhoun in the South, from South Carolina, declared that the new tariff was a tariff of abominations, intolerable to Southerners, that it could simply not be passed. John C. Calhoun threatened that if this tariff were passed, South Carolina would have to leave. He devised what was called the nullification theory. That is to say, John C. Calhoun believed that states should have the power to nullify or cancel out laws that they deemed would be harmful to that state. Andrew Jackson believed this was an attack on the national government. And while these two men were friends, Andrew Jackson strongly opposed the nullification theory. After all, Andrew Jackson said, "I am the president." It was a standoff. The two men's friendship withered away, but a compromise was actually struck. John C. Calhoun was convinced to stop his secessionist talk. And Andrew Jackson went to Congress and said, "Hey, look, lower the tariff. We'll still have a tariff, but you make it lower. And John C. Calhoun, you be quiet." That was the compromise. The next problem came around California. Remember that east-west line that divided free and slave territory? Well, in 1849, there was a gold rush in California, and California had rapidly grown in population and had applied for statehood. California wanted to be a free state. But if you follow that line across, I'll see if I can get my pointer to go straight across, you can see that California would essentially be split in half. This was not acceptable. The Compromise of 1850 included many different laws, compromises, bills that came into effect. Dealing specifically with California, Congress decided California would enter as a free state. Northerners say yay, Southerners say boo. But wait, there's more. Also in the Compromise of 1850, we were going to deal with this territory right here. Yes, the territory that was won in the Mexican War, the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory would be established. And rather than saying that they are free or slave, they decided, let's let the people decide themselves. Let's allow them to vote. Let Utah and New Mexico decide whether or not they want to allow slavery. Northerners said, boo. After all, this is saying that we're not going to have a guaranteed free territory. Southerners, yay, because this gives them the opportunity to extend their power base. Another key issue that had to be resolved dealt with Washington, D.C., where slavery was entrenched and slave trade had been going on. Unfortunately, many Northerners believed that slavery and the slave trade was antiquated, it was backwards, and it made the United States look bad. Washington, D.C. was home to many diplomats from European nations who had already declared that slavery was not allowed. And the slave trade made Washington, D.C. look very, very bad. So the compromise was that slave trade would be banned in Washington, D.C., but not slavery. So slavery was still permitted, just not the open market slave trade. Again, a compromise. To appease Southerners, stricter fugitive slave laws were also passed for the Compromise of 1850. What this meant was slaves who escaped from the South could be hunted down by armed Southerners and brought back to their plantations. Further, any Northerner who was caught assisting slaves in their escape would be punished by law. Southerners appreciated this, the Northerners not so much. The next major conflict came with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas and Nebraska Territory, part of the Louisiana Purchase, was one of the later territories to be organized. The organization was led by an Illinois senator named Stephen Douglas, who believed that if we organize the Kansas and Nebraska Territory, we can build a transcontinental railroad that would run through the state of Illinois, thus making his state a little more important. Well, being entirely north of the original Missouri Compromise line, these two territories should have been free. But in order for Stephen Douglas to get the territory organized, he needed Southern support. He called on those Southern states, asked them what he could do to get their votes, and they said, "We'll vote for you if you declare popular sovereignty." And that's what they decided to do. This is going to repeal the Missouri Compromise line. It's going to say that line does not exist, that any state or any territory can decide the issue based on popular sovereignty, whatever the vote is. Now, Stephen Douglas was not a big fan of slavery. He didn't really like it. But Stephen Douglas believed that the people of Kansas and the people of Nebraska would actually vote against slavery, that they would say, no, slavery has no place here. After all, we're talking about vast Great Plains, not plantations. This is not going to be a good place to have the need for a lot of cheap agricultural labor. And so Stephen Douglas believed that the people of Kansas and Nebraska would vote slavery down anyway, that it didn't belong in those territories economically. However, if you look back on the map, many people from Missouri crossed the border into Kansas to cast a vote when it came to popular sovereignty. Many people from Texas traveled north into Kansas to vote for popular sovereignty, and they all wanted to vote pro-slavery. The pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces clashed. Led by this guy drawn here, John Brown, Bleeding Kansas erupted. Pro-slavery versus anti-slavery forces locked in and shot and killed each other, causing what we call Bleeding Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, but violence was the result. John Brown was what we would consider to be an abolitionist. The abolitionist movement grew in the North. These people wanted an immediate end to slavery in the United States and all of its territories. They were led by this man here, William Lloyd Garrison. He published a magazine, an anti-slavery newspaper that was called The Liberator. And many New England religious leaders saw slavery as a violation to many Christian principles. They read The Liberator, they believed in what he advocated, and they also in turn pressed for abolition. Again, complete abolishment and immediate abolishment of slavery where it already exists. In the South, we do have a series of slave revolts. Well, one. Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser are the two men who get the credit for organizing slave revolts here in the South. Nat Turner's here in Virginia. His was the only one that actually got off the ground. Gabriel Prosser's slave revolt never even got started. But Nat Turner's revolt was there. It did happen. It was rather violent. Dozens of slaves got together, were armed, and took the lives of several white slave owners and plantation residents. And this caused panic and fear throughout the South. In some states, like South Carolina, slaves actually outnumbered the number of whites in the state. And so when we take a look at what effect this had on the South, it frightened white Southerners, which in turn caused the slave codes to become more strict, in the end harming more slaves as these slave codes became more strict. And Southerners who may have even favored abolition were now intimidated into silence. And very, very harsh laws were enacted against fugitive slaves. So the one violent slave revolt from Nat Turner did have a negative effect for the slaves who lived in the South. In 1854, we have the birth of the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln is going to be the first real prominent Republican as he joined this new Republican Party. The Republicans tended to oppose the idea of spreading slavery. They liked the idea of having free soil, that is, expansion, but they did not want the spread of slavery. They were a coalition, that is, a group of many groups. And so they had many different political groups who joined in. I mentioned the Free Soilers, but the abolitionists were also part of this early Republican Party. And Abraham Lincoln does become the prominent leader. Abraham Lincoln challenges Stephen Douglas, who I mentioned earlier, for the U.S. Senate seat from Illinois, and this is in 1858. Abraham Lincoln had recently joined the Republican Party. Stephen Douglas was a Northern Democrat, and the two of them conducted numerous debates while running for the office of Senate in Illinois in 1858. Abraham Lincoln opposed the spread of slavery into new states. Stephen Douglas stood for popular sovereignty. While both men did not like the idea of spreading slavery, Stephen Douglas said it will die on its own. Abraham Lincoln said we need to have a law to stop it from spreading. Abraham Lincoln lost this election. But through these debates and the invention of the telegraph, he gained a national audience. These debates were transcribed and reported in newspapers all across the country. And so Abraham Lincoln gains a national audience, as does Stephen Douglas. But this is going to benefit Abraham Lincoln a little bit more, because 2 years later, he is going to run for the office of president. Northerners continued to be outraged at events that were occurring. The Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court overturned the efforts to limit the spread of slavery. The courts ruled that no black man, free or slave, was even a citizen, and so therefore had no rights in a court. Further, they said that anybody who was property needed to be protected as property. That is to say, even if a slave was in the North, in a free territory, he was still a slave and needed to be returned to slavery. That was the Dred Scott decision. Also, the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act continued to outrage Northerners as armed Southerners came into their territory to hunt down what they deemed fugitive slaves based on little or very little evidence and documentation on who was who. And of course, it was even illegal for whites to help slaves escape, and those charges were actually filed. So Northerners are becoming a little bit more outraged at the condition of slavery. Meanwhile, we often overlook the role of women. What's going on with women during this time? Women were not considered equal citizens. Women did not have the right to vote. While women could own property, some states forbid it after women became married. And so there needed to be a push for women's rights. One of the earliest was the women's suffrage movement, which began even before the Civil War. And this is going on at the same time that the abolitionist movement is growing. This is another reform movement, again, designed to give women equal rights, including suffrage, which is the right to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are going to be the two leading ladies in this cause. They became involved in the women's suffrage movement before the Civil War broke out, and they had to continue their work after the Civil War. Though they did work diligently to propose what was called the Seneca Falls Declaration. This was a declaration of independence almost, worded very similarly, demanding that women be given equal rights in courts, equal rights in property, and equal rights at the ballot box. So what are the issues that are going to divide America in the first half of the 19th century? What are the issues that are going to bring about the inevitable conflict of the Civil War? We can begin with the national bank, where it seemed to be a thing of privilege for those in the North and opposed by Southerners. Taxes, or in this case specifically tariffs. Northerners supporting high protective tariffs, Southerners strongly opposed to tariffs. Internal improvements, the building of roads and canals, opposed by many Southerners who simply did not need them and did not see them as being essential, and supported by Northerners who did see them as essential for commerce and betterment of the economy in the nation. And of course, slavery. More specifically, the spread of slavery. Most Northerners saying we oppose the spread of slavery, and Southerners encouraging it because it would increase their power base. These events, these failed compromises, and these issues are going to lead us to the inevitable conflict, which will be the Civil War.